September 52 BC, the Mandubi Plateau in central Gaul. Vercingetorix, war chief of the Arverni and supreme commander of the Gallic Confederation, stood on the walls of Alesia and watched the impossible become real. Below him, stretching across the landscape in geometrically perfect lines, 40,000 Roman legionaries were building the largest siege works the world had ever seen. Not a simple encirclement, not a blockade, an engineering nightmare of double walls, ditches, towers and traps that would span 25 miles of outer fortifications and 11 miles of inner works. The Romans were building a fortress within a fortress, designed to both trap the Gauls inside Alesia and defend against the massive relief army that everyone knew was coming. The Celtic chieftain had united the fractious tribes of Gaul into the largest coalition ever assembled against Rome. Inside Alesia's walls he commanded 80,000 warriors. A relief force of 250,000 Gauls was marching to break the siege. Against them stood Julius Caesar with 40,000 legionaries and 20,000 auxiliaries, surrounded on both sides, outnumbered nearly 5-1, and utterly confident. What happened over the next 6 weeks would not be decided by courage or numbers or even tactical brilliance. It would be decided by something the Gallic warriors could never match: Roman military discipline, the ability of ordinary men to follow complex orders under extreme stress, to maintain formation while exhausted, to execute engineering projects that seemed impossible, and to trust their training when every instinct screamed to run. This is the story of how discipline crushed chaos, how organization defeated bravery, and how 40,000 Romans surrounded by 330,000 Gauls won one of the most decisive battles in human history. The road to Alesia began with a humiliation that Julius Caesar had never experienced. At Gergovia in June 52 BC, Vercingetorix had handed the Romans their first major defeat in Gaul. Caesar's legions, attempting to storm the fortified oppidum, were repulsed with heavy casualties. Nearly 700 legionaries and 46 centurions dead, including men from the prestigious 10th Legion that Caesar considered his best. The psychological impact was devastating. For 8 years, Rome's legions had been unstoppable in Gaul. They had crushed the Helvetii, destroyed Germanic invasions, subdued coastal tribes, and built bridges across the Rhine in 10 days just to prove they could. The myth of Roman invincibility had been the empire's greatest weapon. Gergovia shattered that myth. Vercingetorix understood what many tribal leaders never grasped. You couldn't beat Rome in pitched battle. The legions were too disciplined, their formations too solid, their tactics too refined. But you could bleed them through attrition, scorched earth, guerrilla warfare, strategic withdrawals that denied Rome decisive engagements. Let the legions starve. Let their supply lines stretch. Let the Gallic winter and distance from Italy do what swords and spears could not. After Gergovia, Caesar faced a strategic nightmare. His prestige was damaged. His political enemies in Rome were circling. His legions were short on supplies. The Gallic tribes, smelling Roman blood, were rallying to Vercingetorix in unprecedented numbers. A retreat to Roman Gaul would be seen as defeat, and probably end Caesar's political career. He needed a decisive victory, and he needed it fast. Vercingetorix made the decision that would determine the war's outcome. He chose to concentrate his forces at Alesia. The oppidum sat atop a steep plateau surrounded by rivers on 3 sides, heavily fortified and well supplied. It was strategically positioned to threaten Roman supply routes and rally more Gallic tribes. From a defensive standpoint, it was perfect. Too perfect. Caesar saw the trap and walked into it deliberately. When Roman scouts reported that Vercingetorix was concentrating his entire army at Alesia, Caesar's officers were stunned by his response. "We will besiege them." Legate Titus Labienus, Caesar's most experienced commander, pointed out the obvious problems. Alesia was on high ground, naturally fortified, and held 80,000 warriors. A relief army was certainly coming. The Romans would be caught between 2 forces, outnumbered on both sides. Caesar's response revealed the fundamental difference between Roman and Celtic military thinking. "Then we will build 2 walls, one to keep them in and one to keep the relief force out. We will let discipline defeat numbers." The Roman military engineering that followed was not improvised. It was the execution of centuries of accumulated tactical knowledge, written down in military manuals, practiced in training camps, and executed by soldiers who had done this dozens of times before. Roman legionaries were not just warriors, They were engineers who happened to be excellent at killing. Every legionary carried not just weapons, but tools: a dolabra, a pickaxe for digging, a saw, a basket for earth, a shovel, in addition to their 60 pounds of armour and equipment. They had spent years learning how to dig ditches at specific angles, build palisades to exact specifications, and construct fortifications that followed standardized designs. What seemed impossible to outsiders was routine to Romans. The inner circumvallation, the wall facing Alesia, went up first. 11 miles of fortifications built in less than 3 weeks by men working in rotating shifts around the clock. The Gauls watching from Alesia's walls saw something that must have seemed like sorcery. Thousands of men moving in perfect coordination, no chaos, no confusion, just systematic, relentless progress. The Roman fortification system at Alesia was not a simple wall. It was a layered defence in depth that incorporated every lesson learned from centuries of siege warfare. First, the Romans dug a trench 20 feet wide and 20 feet deep with vertical sides, filled with water diverted from nearby rivers. This was positioned between the main Roman works and Alesia to prevent sudden Gallic sallies. Behind this, the main defensive line began with 2 parallel trenches, each 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep. The inner trench was left dry. The outer was filled with water. The earth from these excavations, approximately 4 million cubic feet of soil, was piled behind the trenches to create a rampart 12 feet high. Atop this rampart, the Romans constructed a palisade of sharpened stakes, raising the total height to 16 feet. At intervals of 80 feet, wooden towers rose another 20 feet above the palisade, providing elevated positions for archers and artillery. But the real genius was in the obstacles. In front of the trenches, the Romans planted 5 rows of sharpened branches angled toward the enemy, interlaced and staked down. The Gauls called them sippi, the Romans called them defensive insurance. Closer in, they dug rows of pits 3 feet deep in quincunx pattern like spots on dice, each containing a sharpened stake and covered with brush to disguise them. The legionaries called these lilia, lilies, because of how they were arranged. Finally, nearest the wall, they hammered wooden stakes with iron hooks into the ground, barely visible above the surface. These stimuli were designed to cripple charging warriors, tangling feet and breaking ankles. The entire system was designed with mathematical precision to channel attacking forces into killing zones where Roman artillery and archers could achieve maximum effectiveness. Every 8 feet of wall, every angle of ditch, every placement of obstacles followed engineering principles that had been refined over centuries. Vercingetorix watched this construction with growing alarm. He had expected a simple blockade that his warriors could assault and break. What he saw instead was a fortified death trap being built with terrifying speed. He ordered attacks to disrupt the construction. On the 4th day of building, a force of 10,000 Gallic cavalry erupted from Alesia's gates at dawn, intending to catch the Romans unprepared and destroy their unfinished works. The Gallic horsemen were among the finest cavalry in the world, brave, skilled, and superbly mounted. They had broken Roman cavalry before. They charged across the plain in a thundering mass of colour and noise, war cries echoing off the surrounding hills, certain they would catch the Roman infantry vulnerable. What happened next demonstrated why discipline mattered more than courage. The Roman working parties did not panic. They did not run. They executed a drill they had practiced hundreds of times. At the sound of the cornu, the curved horn used for tactical signals, every legionary within hearing distance stopped whatever they were doing and moved to predetermined positions. Working parties grabbed weapons that were always stacked within arm's reach. Off-duty soldiers poured from camps already armoured and armed, because regulations required legionaries to be combat-ready at all times. Within 3 minutes, battle lines were formed. Within 5 minutes, cavalry reserves were mounted and moving to intercept. The Gallic charge hit not scattered workers, but formed Roman infantry supported by German auxiliary cavalry that Caesar had specifically recruited to counter Gallic horsemen. The battle was brief and brutal. Gallic cavalry, for all their skill, fought as individual warriors seeking personal glory. Roman and German cavalry fought as coordinated units executing planned tactics. When the Gauls retreated back to Alesia 2 hours later, they left 300 dead on the field, including 3 chiefs. Roman casualties were 19 dead, 67 wounded. The working parties returned to construction. By evening, Another 400 yards of fortifications were complete. Vercingetorix tried 3 more times to disrupt the Roman works. Each time, the result was the same. Disciplined Roman response, coordinated defence, Gallic repulse with heavy casualties. The construction continued without meaningful delay. Inside Alesia, the Gallic War Council faced reality. They could not stop the Roman fortifications. The walls were going up whether they liked it or not. Their only hope was the relief army. Messages had been sent to every tribe in Gaul. A force larger than anything ever assembled was marching to break the siege. But it would take time to gather and more time to march. Alesia had food for 80,000 warriors and 10,000 civilians for perhaps 30 days, maybe 40 if they rationed strictly. Vercingetorix made the hardest decision of the campaign. He expelled the civilians from Alesia. Every mouth that did not fight was a mouth that consumed precious food. Women, children, elderly, approximately 10,000 people were sent out of the gates, expecting the Romans to let them through the lines. It was common practice in Gallic warfare to allow non-combatants to leave. Julius Caesar refused them passage. The refugees were trapped between Alesia's closed gates and Rome's sealed walls. They begged to be let through. They offered to become slaves. They pleaded for their children. The Romans watched from their walls and did nothing. Caesar's decision was calculated cruelty with strategic purpose. Those 10,000 civilians consumed nothing. Their suffering was visible to the Gauls in Alesia, destroying morale. And if Vercingetorix took them back, his food supply became critical even faster. Some Roman soldiers, watching the civilians die slowly of starvation in the no-man's land between the armies, questioned the orders. Centurions shut down dissent immediately. Discipline meant following orders even when those orders seemed cruel. The civilians remained trapped until most had died. The few survivors were eventually taken as slaves. This was total war executed with bureaucratic efficiency. While the inner walls squeezed Alesia, Roman engineers began the outer fortifications. The contravallation facing outward was even more massive. 14 miles of fortifications identical in hull, designed to the inner wall but on a larger scale to account for the wider perimeter. The math was staggering. 25 total miles of fortifications, 40 miles of trenches, some filled with millions of gallons of diverted water, 160 wooden towers, hundreds of thousands of sharpened stakes for palisades and obstacles, millions of cubic feet of earth moved by hand. All of this built in 6 weeks by 40,000 men who were simultaneously maintaining siege operations, conducting patrols, foraging for supplies and fighting off Gallic attacks. The logistics alone should have been impossible. Roman army logistics were the real secret weapon. While Gallic armies lived off the land, took what they needed from conquered territories, and dissolved when food ran out, Roman legions operated on supply chains that stretched back to Italy. Every legion had a logistics officer, the Praefectus Castrorum, responsible for supply, equipment, and transportation. Every cohort had quartermaster staff who tracked inventory, managed distribution, and maintained equipment. Supplies moved along protected roads in organised convoys guarded by auxiliary troops. Food was stockpiled in fortified depots. Equipment was maintained and repaired constantly. When a legionary's armour was damaged, there were smiths to fix it. When weapons broke, there were replacements. When grain ran low, supply columns brought more. The Roman army was not just a fighting force. It was a logistics machine that happened to be very good at killing. At Alesia, this system faced its greatest test. Caesar's legions were operating deep in hostile territory, surrounded by enemies, building massive fortifications that required huge quantities of timber, iron, and food. Failure of supply would mean disaster. Roman quartermasters established fortified supply depots in the rear, connected to the siege works by protected roads. Foraging parties, always in force with cavalry screening, scoured the countryside. Every tree cut for timber was accounted for. Every nail used in construction was tracked. Every grain shipment was logged and distributed according to precise calculations of caloric need. The legionaries received their standard ration of grain, bacon, and wine even while building fortifications under siege conditions. Compare this to the Gallic forces. Vercingetorix, 80,000 warriors had brought what supplies they could carry. There was no organised supply system, no logistics chain, no systematic distribution. As food dwindled, there was no resupply. The relief army, when it came, would face the same problem at larger scale. Feed 250,000 warriors with no supply infrastructure and countryside already stripped bare. Roman discipline extended beyond the physical to the psychological. Every legionary knew his place, knew his role, knew what was expected. The Roman military operated on a command structure that could coordinate complex operations across vast distances. At the top was Caesar, overall commander whose strategic decisions shaped the campaign. Below him were legates, typically senators or equestrians commanding individual legions. Each legion had 6 tribunes, officers who handled administrative and tactical functions. The real backbone of the army was the centurions. These were professional soldiers promoted from the ranks, men who had spent 15 to 20 years in service and knew every aspect of military operations. Each century of 80 men had 1 centurion. Each cohort of 6 centuries had a senior centurion. The first cohort of each legion had the primiordines, the senior centurions who were the most experienced men in the army. The primus pilus, the most senior centurion of each legion, was typically a man who had been in service for 25 years, had commanded in dozens of battles, and knew Roman military doctrine better than most generals. These men were the continuity of the legion. Generals came and went, centurions stayed. They enforced discipline, trained recruits, and ensured that orders were executed precisely. When a centurion said jump, legionaries jumped. When he said dig, they dug. When he said hold this line against 10 times your number, they held. This hierarchy allowed the Roman army to coordinate complex operations that would have been impossible for tribal forces. At Alesia, Caesar could issue a single order that would be transmitted through legates to tribunes to centurions to individual centuries, resulting in 40,000 men executing synchronized actions across 25 miles of fortifications. Gallic armies had no comparable structure. War chiefs commanded through personal prestige. Tribal leaders controlled their own warriors. Coordination between tribes was achieved through councils and negotiations. Orders were suggestions that brave men might follow if they agreed. In the chaos of battle, Gallic armies fragmented into individual warriors seeking glory. Roman armies moved as a single organism responding to commands. By mid-September 52nd BC, the fortifications were complete. Alesia was sealed inside the inner wall. The outer wall stood ready to receive the relief army. The Romans had built their trap and now waited for both jaws to close. Inside Alesia, food was running out. Vercingetorix had imposed strict rationing, but 80,000 men consume enormous quantities of food. The initial supply of grain was exhausted. They had slaughtered all the horses, eating the meat and using the hide for armor repair. They were butchering dogs and boiling leather for whatever nutrition could be extracted. Warriors who had marched to Alesia proud and confident were now gaunt and desperate. But they had not broken. Gallic warriors were among the toughest people in the ancient world. They endured hardship that would have destroyed softer peoples. They still believed in their war chief, still trusted that the relief army would come, still had courage even as their bodies weakened. On September 20th, Gallic scouts brought word that made Alesia's walls erupt. In celebration, the relief army was approaching. From the Roman walls, lookouts reported what seemed like the earth itself was moving. Tens of thousands of warriors, perhaps 250,000 according to Caesar's later account, were converging on Alesia from multiple directions. Modern historians debate the exact numbers. Some argue Caesar inflated figures for propaganda purposes. Conservative estimates place the relief force at 100,000 to 150,000. Even accepting the lower estimates, the Romans were still outnumbered more than 3 to 1, caught between 2 armies, low on supplies themselves. Caesar assembled his officers for final instructions. What he said was recorded by multiple sources and reveals the Roman mindset. "Gentlemen, we have accomplished what we came to do. The enemy is exactly where we want them, inside our walls and outside them. Now we demonstrate why Rome conquers the world. Not through superior numbers, but through superior discipline. Each man knows his duty. Each century knows its position. Each cohort knows its role. We do not need to be braver than the Gauls. We just need to be more disciplined. Follow your orders, trust your training, stand your ground. Rome does not yield." The legionaries did not cheer. They did not need speeches or motivation. They simply returned to their positions and waited. The relief army commander was Commius of the Atrebates, one of the few Gallic leaders with any understanding of Roman military methods. He had once been Caesar's ally and understood Roman tactics better than most tribal leaders. He also understood the Romans had built something unprecedented. Commius divided his forces. The main army, approximately 180,000 warriors, would assault the outer Roman wall from the west. A select force of 60,000, the best warriors from each tribe, would take the high ground on Mount Rea to the north, where the Roman fortifications were thinnest due to terrain difficulties. Simultaneously, Vercingetorix would sortie from Alesia, attacking the inner wall from the east. The Romans would face coordinated attacks from 3 directions, stretching their forces impossibly thin. It was the best plan the Gauls could devise. Against any other opponent, it would have worked. The first assault came at dawn on October 1st, 52nd BC. Thousands of Gallic warriors hit the outer Roman wall in a massive wave attack, screaming war cries and banging weapons against shields to terrify the defenders. The Romans watched them come in silence. When the Gauls were 50 yards from the walls, Roman artillery opened fire. Caesar had positioned dozens of ballistae and scorpions, essentially giant crossbows and bolt throwers, along the walls. These weapons had been mass-produced in Roman workshops following standardized designs, brought to Alesia disassembled and reassembled by trained engineers. Each ballista crew had practiced loading and firing thousands of times. The rate of fire was devastating. Bolts 4 feet long and thick as a man's. Wrist punched through multiple warriors at once. Stone shot from ballistae crushed skulls and shattered shields. The Gallic charge staggered under the mechanical storm, but they kept coming. These were brave men fighting for their homeland, and they had numbers. They reached the first line of obstacles, the stimuli iron hooks that tore at legs and feet. Warriors tripped and fell. Those behind trampled them in the press. The charge slowed but did not stop. They reached the lilia, the covered pits. The first warriors fell through the brush covers, impaled on stakes at the bottom. Screams of agony cut through the war cries. The charge fragmented as warriors tried to avoid the traps they could not see. Behind them, centurions were shouting coordinates to artillery crews, adjusting fire to maximum effect. Roman archers, standing on wooden platforms behind the walls, began systematic volley fire. Not individual aim shots, but coordinated volleys of hundreds of arrows dropping into predetermined kill zones. The Gauls reached the Sippi, the fields of sharpened branches. Here, the charge broke down completely. Warriors had to hack through the obstacles while Roman arrows and artillery bolts rained down. Some made it through to the trenches only to discover they could not cross. The first trench was filled with water too deep to wade, too wide to jump. Some tried to swim and drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others tried to fill the trench with bodies and brush. Roman defenders threw pillar, heavy javelins designed to punch through shields and armour at point-blank range. The few warriors who somehow crossed both trenches and reached the rampart found a 12-foot earthen wall topped by a palisade with defenders raining down projectiles from above. It was impossible to climb under fire. The assault lasted 4 hours. By mid-morning the Gauls withdrew, leaving hundreds of dead tangled in the obstacles or floating in the trenches. Roman casualties were 23 dead, 147 wounded. The fortifications had worked exactly as designed. But this was only the first attack. While the main assault was failing on the western wall, Commius had launched his elite force against Mount Rea. Here, the terrain had prevented the Romans from building their full defensive system. The fortifications were thinner, the obstacles less dense. If the Gauls could break through here, they could get behind the Roman lines and roll up the entire defensive system. Caesar had anticipated this. He had positioned the 10th Legion, his best troops, on Mount Rea with cavalry reserves ready to reinforce. When 60,000 screaming Gallic warriors came up the slope, they hit prepared defensive positions manned by veteran legionaries who had fought in every major engagement of the Gallic wars. The fighting on Mount Rea was close and brutal. Gauls reached the Roman palisade in some places, engaging in hand-to-hand combat at the wall. This was not the mechanized slaughter of the western wall, but desperate personal violence. Swords against shields, spears against armour, men grappling and stabbing in the press of bodies. Roman training and equipment made the difference. Each legionary wore larica segmentata, articulated armour that protected torso and shoulders while allowing movement. Each carried a scutum, the large rectangular shield that could interlock with others to form an impenetrable wall. Each had spent years drilling in formation fighting, learning to work as a unit rather than an individual. The Gauls, braver and often larger, wore less armour and fought as individuals. A Roman legionary in formation with support from the men beside him could hold off multiple Gallic warriors. When a legionary fell, the man behind stepped forward seamlessly. When a shield broke, another appeared from the rear ranks. The formation held. After 6 hours of continuous fighting, the Gallic assault on Mount Rea broke. The warriors had fought with incredible bravery, taking losses that would have shattered most armies, but they could not break Roman discipline. The legionaries had held their ground, followed their training, and executed their orders despite being outnumbered and exhausted. As the Gauls withdrew, Caesar rode the line inspecting his troops. Centurions reported losses, 89 dead, 340 wounded on Mount Rea alone, but the line had held. Caesar ordered the wounded evacuated to the rear, fresh troops moved into position, and defensive works repaired. By evening, the Romans were ready for the next attack. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix had watched both assaults fail. He had been ready to sortie, to hit the inner Roman wall while the relief force attacked from outside, but the relief attacks had been repulsed too quickly. A sortie now would be suicide, throwing his starving warriors against prepared defences while gaining nothing. He held his forces back, waiting for a coordinated attack. That night, Commius and Vercingetorix coordinated through signal fires. The next assault would be simultaneous, massive, and do or die. If it failed, the relief army would have to withdraw and Alesia would starve. October 2nd, 52 BC. Just before dawn, 250,000 Gallic warriors prepared for the largest assault. Every able-bodied man from the relief force would attack the outer walls. Every warrior in Alesia would sortie against the inner fortifications. The Romans would face attacks from both sides simultaneously, across 25 miles of fortifications, 40,000 legionaries against 330,000 Gauls. Caesar spent the night riding the fortifications, visiting every sector, speaking to centurions and ensuring supplies of arrows, peeler and stones were positioned at every tower. He was 47 years old, supposedly suffering from epilepsy, and had not slept properly in 2 weeks. But he appeared calm and confident, because that is what his men needed to see. The attack began at first light with a roar that echoed across the valley. From the outer walls, Roman lookouts saw a sight that must have seemed apocalyptic. The largest army assembled in Gaul's history charging across the plain, a tide of humanity that stretched across the entire western perimeter. Simultaneously, Alesia's gates burst open and 80,000 warriors poured out, attacking the inner wall from all directions. The Romans were fighting on both sides of their fortifications. Caesar's command system executed its purpose. He positioned himself in a central tower, where he could see most of the battlefield and dispatch reserves to crisis points. Messengers, carefully selected young officers who knew the layout of the fortifications intimately, waited for orders. Signal flags and horns communicated basic commands. Each legion sector knew its responsibility. Each cohort had predetermined positions. Each century had specific duties. There was no confusion, no debate, no hesitation. The plan had been made. Now it was simply execution. The western outer wall took the brunt of the relief army assault. Tens of thousands of Gallic warriors hit the fortifications in waves. The obstacles that had been so effective the previous day were now filled with bodies and brush, partially neutralized by sheer mass of attackers. Gauls were getting through the Sippi fields, crossing the lilies despite horrific casualties, reaching the trenches. Some sections of trench were being bridged with logs and fascines that the Gauls had prepared overnight. For the first time, substantial numbers of warriors were reaching the Roman rampart. The fighting devolved into brutal close combat. Legionaries on the walls thrust downward with peeler and swords at warriors trying to climb the earthen rampart. Gauls threw spears and axes upward, trying to kill defenders and create gaps in the line. The noise was deafening, a constant roar of men screaming, weapons clashing, wounded crying out. Caesar watched from his command tower and saw a section of outer wall beginning to buckle. A mass of Gallic warriors had concentrated against a single, 200-yard sector, overwhelming the defenders through sheer pressure of numbers. If they broke through, they could get behind the fortifications and the entire defensive system would collapse. He dispatched 6 cohorts of the 13th Legion, approximately 2,400 men, with orders to plug the gap. The cohorts moved at double time, not running in panic but in formation, maintaining order even in crisis. They arrived at the threatened sector, slotted into position, and counterattacked. The Gallic warriors, who had nearly achieved breakthrough, suddenly faced fresh troops in perfect formation. The Roman advance pushed them back off the rampart, back across the trench, back into the killing zone of the obstacles. Artillery crews adjusted fire. Archers targeted warriors trying to retreat. The crisis was contained. On the eastern inner wall, Vercingetorix's sortie was achieving limited success. The Gauls had filled the trenches with earth and fascines at several points, creating bridges. Warriors were crossing in large numbers, reaching the Roman palisade, engaging in hand-to-hand combat. But the inner fortifications were stronger than the outer, the obstacles more dense, and the defenders were fighting with their backs to another wall. There was no retreat. Centurions up and down the line were doing what centurions did best, holding their men together under impossible pressure. When soldiers faltered, centurions personally led by example, stepping into the front rank and fighting. When sections of line were depleted, centurions pulled men from quieter sectors to reinforce. The Roman command structure, built on experienced professional soldiers who knew their jobs, kept the defence functioning even as individual soldiers fell. By mid-morning, the situation was desperate but stable. The Romans were holding both walls but taking casualties they could not afford. The Gauls were suffering horrific losses, but had such overwhelming numbers that they could sustain attacks that would have broken any other army. Then Commius played his final card. The 60,000 elite warriors he had positioned on Mount Rea attacked again, this time with the goal of punching through the weakened fortifications and getting into the Roman rear. If they succeeded, Caesar's entire position would collapse. Every reserve would be committed. The battle would devolve into chaos where superior Gallic numbers would prevail. The assault on Mount Rea was preceded by thousands of Gallic archers firing en masse to suppress Roman defenders. Under this covering fire, warriors with ladders and grappling hooks rushed the fortifications. The terrain prevented Roman artillery from firing effectively downward. The attackers had learned from the previous day's failures. They came in organised waves, not wild charges. They focused on overwhelming specific points rather than dispersing across the entire front. This was the Gauls fighting with something approaching Roman tactical sophistication, and it was working. A section of palisade came down under concentrated attack. Gallic warriors poured through the gap. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted inside the Roman fortifications. If this breach widened, the position would be lost. Caesar saw the crisis developing. Every reserve was committed. He had nothing left except his personal cavalry guard, approximately 1,000 German auxiliary horsemen he kept for his own protection. He made a decision that would define his reputation for audacity. He led them himself. At 47 years old, Julius Caesar armed himself, mounted his horse, and led a cavalry charge directly at the breakthrough point. The sight of the Roman commander personally leading the counterattack galvanized the defense. Legionaries who had been on the edge of breaking suddenly found renewed resolve. If Caesar himself was willing to die here, how could they do less? The German cavalry smashed into the Gallic warriors who had penetrated the fortifications. These were not civilized. Romans fighting by rules, but tribal Germanic warriors who had spent their lives raiding across the Rhine. They fought with axes and long swords, targeting necks and limbs, killing with savage efficiency. Caesar fought in the front rank. Multiple ancient sources confirm he personally killed several enemy warriors. His distinctive scarlet cloak and plumed helmet made him a target, but they also made him a visible symbol that inspired every Roman who could see him. The breakthrough was sealed. Gallic warriors were trapped inside the fortifications and methodically slaughtered. The assault on Mount Rea broke. Simultaneously, Caesar ordered his cavalry to sortie from hidden gates in the rear fortifications, circle around, and hit the relief army from behind. 3,000 Roman and German cavalry erupted from concealed positions and charged into the rear of the massed Gallic warriors attacking the outer wall. The Gauls had no warning. Suddenly they were being attacked from behind while still engaged with the fortifications in front. The psychological shock was devastating. Gallic warriors began to break and run. The panic spread like fire through dry grass. Warriors who had been fighting with incredible bravery moments before suddenly realized they were trapped between cavalry and fortifications with no escape. The retreat became a rout. The Roman cavalry pursued, cutting down fleeing warriors. The artillery crews adjusted fire to target the retreating masses. The killing was mechanical and efficient. The relief army disintegrated, tens of thousands of warriors fled in every direction, abandoning weapons and equipment. Entire tribal contingents broke apart. The largest army ever assembled in Gaul was destroyed not through superior courage, but through the collapse of morale when discipline met chaos. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the relief army dissolve. He ordered his warriors to withdraw back into the city. The sortie had failed. The relief force had failed. There would be no rescue. October 3rd, 52 BC. Alesia's walls were silent. The Gallic warriors inside were out of food, exhausted and demoralized. The relief army was scattered and would not reform. Vercingetorix faced the reality that his war was lost. He could continue fighting, leading 80,000 men in a suicidal last stand. Or he could surrender and hope Caesar would spare the warriors. The Gallic war chief chose surrender, but he did it in a way that would become legend. The next morning, Vercingetorix armed himself in his finest armour, painted himself with woad in the old Celtic tradition, and rode out of Alesia's gates alone. He crossed the empty killing ground between Alesia and the Roman fortifications, riding slowly, displaying himself to the watching armies. At the Roman camp, Caesar had assembled his legions in formal parade formation. The general sat on a raised tribunal, surrounded by his officers in full ceremonial armour. Vercingetorix rode up to the tribunal, dismounted, removed his weapons and armour, and knelt at Caesar's feet without speaking. The act was pure theatre on both sides, Vercingetorix displaying Gallic nobility and defeat, Caesar demonstrating Roman clemency toward a worthy opponent. Except there was no clemency. Vercingetorix was taken in chains. He would spend 6 years in a Roman dungeon, brought out only to be displayed in Caesar's triumph parade in Rome, then ritually strangled in the Tullianum prison. His warriors were sold into slavery or distributed as rewards to Roman soldiers. His nation was crushed. The surrender of Alesia ended the Gallic wars. Scattered resistance would continue for months, but organised opposition was finished. Within 2 years, Gaul was a Roman province, peaceful, taxed, and integrated into the empire. The battle's significance extended far beyond Gaul. Caesar's victory provided wealth and prestige that he would use to seize control of Rome itself, triggering civil war and ultimately ending the Roman Republic. The tactics developed at Alesia, the use of fortifications and siegecraft to defeat superior numbers, became standard Roman doctrine. The demonstration of what disciplined troops could accomplish against overwhelming odds influenced military thinking for centuries. But the real lesson of Alesia was about the nature of military power. The Gauls had everything that primitive societies valued in warfare: courage, individual skill, overwhelming numbers, home ground advantage, strong leaders. They fought for their homes, their families, their freedom. Their warriors were physically impressive, well-armed, and willing to die. None of it mattered. The Romans had something the Gauls could never develop in their tribal societies: systematic organisation, soldiers who followed complex orders without question, officers who coordinated operations across vast distances, engineers who could build fortifications that seemed impossible, logistics systems that kept armies fed and equipped far from home. Most importantly, soldiers who could stand in formation while outnumbered and exhausted, not because they were braver, but because discipline overrode the natural human instinct to flee. The Roman military system was not the product of brilliant individuals, but centuries of institutional development. Training manuals that codified tactics, engineering standards that could be replicated anywhere, command structures that allowed coordination, logistics systems that enabled sustained operations, equipment that was mass-produced to standardized specifications. Every part of the system was designed to work with every other part, creating an organization that was greater than the sum of its individuals. A single Roman legionary was not necessarily better than a single Gallic warrior, but 40,000 Romans organized into legions with standardized training, coordinated tactics, and centralized command could defeat 330,000 Gauls who fought as individuals and tribes. At Alesia, Julius Caesar commanded approximately 60,000 men. The Gallic forces combined numbered over 300,000. The Romans suffered approximately 12,000 casualties during the entire siege. The Gauls lost over 200,000 dead, with the survivors enslaved or scattered. The decisive factor was not courage, weaponry, or even generalship. It was discipline, the ability to follow orders, maintain formation, execute complex plans, and continue fighting when every instinct screamed to run. Roman soldiers did not need to be heroes. They just needed to do their jobs, stand in this line, build this fortification, follow this command. The system did the rest. Tribal armies, for all their bravery, could never develop this kind of institutional discipline. They fought as collections of individuals, coordinated through personal relationships and tribal loyalty. They had courage, but not cohesion, spirit, but not structure, numbers, but not organization. Against an enemy that valued discipline above individual glory, bravery meant nothing. The Gallic warriors at Alesia were not cowards. They charged into mechanical storms of artillery and arrows. They climbed fortifications under fire. They fought with incredible determination against impossible odds. Their courage was never in question. But courage without organization is just noise and fury. It creates impressive spectacles and moving last stands, but it does not win wars against disciplined enemies. The Romans understood something fundamental about organized violence. War is not about individual heroics. It is about systems, logistics, training, coordination, structure. The side that can maintain organization under stress, execute complex plans under pressure, and coordinate thousands of individuals toward common goals will defeat the side that relies on individual courage and improvisation, regardless of numbers. This is why Rome conquered the Mediterranean while tribal peoples, despite often being physically tougher and individually braver, were defeated again and again. This is why disciplined armies throughout history have crushed larger but less organized forces. This is why at Alesia, 40,000 Romans surrounded by 330,000 Gauls won decisively. Discipline crushed chaos. Organization defeated bravery. System triumphed over individuals. And the sky above Alesia belonged to Rome. The Roman victory at Alesia was total, but the mechanics of how it was achieved deserve deeper examination. The fortifications that surrounded Alesia represented more than just impressive engineering. They represented centuries of accumulated military knowledge transformed into practical application by soldiers who had been trained to build as well as fight. Every Roman legionary underwent construction training as part of basic military education. At training camps throughout the empire, recruits spent as much time learning to dig ditches at precise angles and build palisades to exact specifications as they did practicing with swords. This was not optional specialty. Training. It was fundamental to being a Roman soldier. The concept was revolutionary. Most ancient armies treated soldiers as fighters who might occasionally dig. Rome treated soldiers as military engineers who also fought. The dolabra, the legionary's multi-purpose tool, was as important as his gladius. This pickaxe-like implement could chop wood, dig earth, and cut sod. Combined with his saw and basket, each legionary was a mobile construction unit. Multiply this by 40,000 men, organize them into shifts working around the clock, and you could build the impossible in weeks. But tools alone did not build Alesia's fortifications. The real secret was standardization. Roman military engineering manuals, passed down through generations and refined through countless campaigns, specified exact measurements for every element. Trenches were 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep, not approximately 15 feet, exactly 15 feet. Palisade stakes were cut to uniform length. Towers were built to standard dimensions. This standardization meant that soldiers did not need to think or improvise. They followed the manual. A legionary transferred from the 10th Legion to the 13th would build identical fortifications, because both had learned from the same specifications. The speed of Roman construction at Alesia shocked contemporaries. Greek historians who later examined the battlefield could not comprehend how such massive works were completed so quickly. The answer lay in systematic organization. Caesar divided his army into work details operating in coordinated shifts. While 1/3 of the force worked on fortifications, another third stood guard, and the final third rested. Every 8 hours, shifts rotated. This meant construction continued 24 hours a day, without exhausting any single group of men. Each shift had specific tasks assigned by centurions, who had overseen similar projects dozens of times. Soldiers did not wander around wondering what to do. They reported to their sentry's work site, received orders from their centurion, and executed predetermined tasks. Dig this section of trench, cut timber from this area, transport these stakes to that tower position. The granularity of task assignment meant that every man knew exactly what he needed to accomplish in his shift. The timber consumption alone was staggering. Modern calculations suggest the fortifications at Alesia required approximately 30,000 trees. These had to be located, felled, transported, stripped, cut to specific lengths, sharpened, and emplaced. Roman work parties accomplished this through systematic forest management. Scouts identified suitable timber areas. Work details moved to those areas under guard. Trees were felled by soldiers trained in logging techniques. The timber was processed on site to reduce transport weight, then hauled to construction areas by ox cart along temporary roads that work parties had built specifically for this purpose. Nothing was left to chance or improvisation. When a centurion ordered a tower built, the soldiers constructing it did not need to figure out dimensions or structural requirements. They followed a standard design that had been proven in dozens of previous sieges. The tower would be 20 feet square at the base, 40 feet tall with internal floors every 10 feet and a protective parapet at the top. Every tower was identical because every tower followed the same plan. The Gauls watching this construction from Alesia's walls saw something fundamentally alien to their worldview. Celtic warfare valued individual prowess and spontaneous courage. Leaders led by personal example and charisma. Warriors followed chiefs they respected. Organization was tribal and personal. The Romans were building like insects, each individual performing small repetitive tasks that combined into something massive and impersonal. There was no visible individual heroism, no dramatic gestures, just systematic, relentless labor that produced results. This cultural difference extended to every aspect of military operations. When Gallic warriors prepared for battle, they worked themselves into emotional states through drinking, chanting, and displays of individual courage. Warriors boasted of their prowess, challenged enemies to single combat, and whipped themselves into battle fury. This was psychologically effective for the warriors themselves, building courage and suppressing fear. But it created armies that operated on emotion rather than calculation. Roman pre-battle preparation was bureaucratic. Officers inspected equipment. Centurions verified that each man had the required arrows, pila, and stones. Quartermasters distributed rations. Medical orderlies positioned themselves at predetermined locations behind the lines. Trumpeters reviewed the signals they would use to communicate orders. Engineers checked that ballistae were properly tensioned and aimed. It was methodical, unemotional, and overwhelmingly effective. When the Gallic Relief Army launched its massive assault on October 2nd, their approach was based on courage and numbers, hundreds of thousands of warriors attacking simultaneously across multiple sectors, overwhelming the defenders through sheer mass and ferocity. It was a plan that had worked for Celtic armies for centuries. Against less organised enemies, this human tide was unstoppable. The Roman response was coordinated through a command and control system that had no equivalent in the ancient world. Caesar positioned himself in a central observation tower with messengers ready to carry orders. Signal stations equipped with flags and horns were positioned at intervals along the fortifications. Each legion sector had a command group in constant communication with higher headquarters. When Caesar identified a crisis point, he dispatched orders. Those orders moved through the command structure and resulted in cohorts redeploying to threaten sectors within minutes. This level of battlefield coordination required something the Gauls did not have: a shared tactical language. Roman soldiers trained with standardized signals and commands. The sound of the cornu horn meant form defensive line. A raised red flag meant prepare for cavalry attack. Specific trumpet calls indicated advance, withdraw, or wheel left. Every legionary throughout the army knew these signals. Orders did not need to be explained or debated. They were transmitted and executed. The Gallic command structure had no equivalent capability. Tribal war chiefs could inspire their warriors and lead charges, but they could not coordinate complex tactical maneuvers across miles of battlefield. When the relief army attacked, each tribal contingent essentially fought its own battle. Some tribes attacked with great ferocity while others held back. Some pressed attacks after others had withdrawn. There was no synchronized timing, no coordinated pressure, no systematic exploitation of successes. The discipline gap was most visible when battles turned against each side. When Roman positions came under overwhelming pressure and soldiers began to waver, Centurions personally stepped into the front rank and held the line through example. The command structure remained intact. Orders continued flowing. Fresh troops moved to crisis points. The organization persisted even under extreme stress. When Gallic attacks failed and warriors began retreating, the tribal armies fragmented. There was no organized withdrawal, no rear guard, no rally points. Warriors fled as individuals trying to save themselves. What had been an army became a mob. The Roman cavalry pursuits slaughtered warriors who could have defended themselves if they had maintained organization. This pattern repeated throughout ancient military history. Disciplined forces maintained cohesion under stress. Tribal forces excelled in initial attacks fueled by courage, but collapsed when that emotional momentum broke. The Romans built their entire military system around maintaining organization precisely because they understood this dynamic. Roman soldiers were not naturally braver than Gauls. If anything, the Celtic warriors had a cultural tradition that valued death in battle as glorious. Romans feared death as much as anyone. But Roman soldiers had been trained for years to follow orders regardless of their emotional state. The centurion said, "Hold this position," so you held it even if you were terrified. The training drills you had performed hundreds of times took over, allowing you to function even when your mind was screaming panic. This training was built on repetition to the point of muscle memory. Legionaries practiced the same sword drills thousands of times. They practiced forming shield walls until they could do it while half asleep. They practiced responding to trumpet signals until the response was automatic. In the chaos of battle, when rational thought became impossible, training took over. You did not need to think about what to do. Your body knew. The Gallic warriors were often more experienced fighters. Many had been in dozens of battles, raids and feuds. They knew how to handle weapons and had killed men in combat. But their experience was individual. Each warrior developed his own style, his own techniques. There was no standardized training, no common tactical doctrine. This meant that in formation fighting, where coordination mattered more than individual skill, the less experienced but systematically trained Romans had the advantage. At Alesia, many Roman legionaries were relatively young soldiers with only a few years of service. They faced Gallic warriors who had been fighting since childhood. In individual combat, the Gauls often had the edge, but in formation combat, where the Roman next to you covered your right side while you covered his left, where the entire century moved as a single unit, individual skill mattered less than coordination. The system compensated for individual weaknesses. The Romans also had equipment advantages that multiplied the effectiveness of their discipline. The scutum, the large rectangular shield, was designed specifically for formation fighting. It was too heavy and awkward for individual combat, but in formation, where shields locked together, it created a mobile wall that was nearly impenetrable. The gladius, the short sword, was optimized for stabbing in close quarters where there was no room for sweeping cuts. These were not weapons for heroes. They were weapons for soldiers fighting in coordinated units. Roman armor was standardized and mass-produced. The lorica segmentata, the articulated plate armor, provided excellent protection while allowing movement. More importantly, it was made from interchangeable components. If a section was damaged, it could be replaced without discarding the entire piece. Damaged armor was collected after battles, repaired in mobile workshops, and returned to service. The Gauls had no comparable system. A warrior whose armor was destroyed might fight without protection until he could afford replacement. The Roman logistical system extended to medical care. Each legion had trained medici, medical orderlies, who had learned basic wound treatment and could perform simple surgeries. Behind the lines at Alesia, medical stations were set up where wounded soldiers received treatment. Clean water, bandages, and basic surgical instruments were stockpiled. Wounded legionaries who would have died in Gallic armies survived to return to duty. This was not motivated by compassion, but calculation. A legionary represented years of training and significant investment. Saving wounded soldiers was economically sensible, but the effect on morale was significant. Soldiers fought harder knowing that if wounded they would receive care. The Gallic warriors knew that serious wounds often meant death or abandonment. This affected how aggressively they fought when already injured. The siege itself demonstrated Roman logistical superiority. Maintaining 60,000 men under siege conditions for 6 weeks required approximately 500 tons of grain, 100,000 gallons of wine, and countless tons of other supplies. All of this was brought forward from Roman-controlled Gaul, along supply lines that stretched hundreds of miles. Convoys moved under guard along established routes. Supplies were stockpiled in fortified depots. Distribution was tracked and recorded. Inside Alesia, 80,000 Gallic warriors had brought what supplies they could carry and whatever the city had stockpiled. There was no resupply, no logistics system, no systematic distribution. When food ran out, it simply ran out. The contrast was stark. Roman soldiers ate their standard rations throughout the siege while literally surrounded by enemies. Gallic warriors starved despite having hundreds of thousands of relief troops nearby. The relief army faced even worse logistical problems. Commius had assembled 250,000 warriors from tribes across Gaul. This massive force consumed approximately 300 tons of food daily. They had no supply system beyond foraging and whatever each warrior brought. The countryside around Alesia had already been stripped by Roman foraging parties. Within days of arriving, the relief army was running out of food. They had to attack immediately, not because of tactical considerations, but because they could not sustain their army. Another week, and they would have begun dissolving as warriors returned home to eat. This fundamental logistical weakness shaped Celtic military capabilities throughout their history. Celtic armies could assemble massive forces for short periods, but could not sustain them. Campaigns were measured in weeks, not months. Sieges were impossible because tribal armies could not maintain supply lines. The Romans could fight campaigns that lasted years, maintain sieges indefinitely, and operate thousands of miles from Italy. This logistical capacity was as important as tactical prowess. The Roman military system was also self-sustaining in ways tribal armies could never match. Experienced soldiers trained new recruits. Centurions who had served for decades passed knowledge to younger officers. Engineering techniques were documented in manuals. Successful tactics were systematically incorporated into training. Each generation of Roman soldiers was better trained than the last, because the institution accumulated and preserved knowledge. Gallic military knowledge was personal and tribal. A great warrior might train his sons and nephews, passing on techniques and wisdom. But when he died, much of that knowledge died with him. There was no systematic preservation of tactical innovations. Each generation partially reinvented warfare based on personal experience. The institutional knowledge that made Rome's military so formidable simply did not exist in Celtic society. The aftermath of Alesia demonstrated another Roman advantage, the ability to absorb and integrate conquered peoples. Within a generation, Gauls were serving in Roman legions, bringing their warrior traditions into the Roman system. The best elements of Celtic warfare, particularly their excellent cavalry, were incorporated into Roman military practice. But these Celtic soldiers now operated within Roman discipline and organisation. They maintained their individual fighting skills but gained the benefits of systematic training and coordination. This cultural flexibility was possible because Roman identity was not primarily ethnic. You became Roman by adopting Roman culture, speaking Latin, and accepting Roman authority. A Gaul who served in the legions, learned Latin, and followed Roman customs could become fully Roman. His children would be indistinguishable from Italian Romans. This assimilation created a constant flow of new talent and ideas into Roman institutions while maintaining the core organizational principles that made those institutions effective. The Gallic tribes, by contrast, maintained rigid ethnic identities. You were born into a tribe and remained in that tribe. Intertribal cooperation was temporary and fragile, based on personal relationships between chiefs rather than institutional frameworks. The massive relief army that assembled at Alesia was the largest coalition ever achieved in Gaul, and it held together for less than 2 weeks before shattering. This inability to create lasting multi-tribal institutions limited Celtic political and military development. Individual tribes could be formidable opponents. Coalitions could assemble impressive numbers, but they could never create the sustained organized power that Rome wielded. After Alesia, the tribes were defeated separately, absorbed into Roman administration, and within 2 generations had largely ceased to exist as independent political entities. The battle also demonstrated the power of infrastructure. Roman military success was built on roads. The famous Roman roads that eventually spanned the empire were initially military supply routes. These roads allowed rapid movement of troops and supplies over vast distances. An army could march from Italy to Gaul in weeks rather than months, Supplies could be transported reliably. Messages could be carried by relay riders at speeds that would not be matched until the telegraph. The Gauls had no comparable infrastructure. Warriors travelled on foot along paths and trails. Moving large armies was slow and difficult. Supply transport was nearly impossible beyond what could be carried. This infrastructure deficit meant that Roman armies could concentrate forces faster, supply them better, and operate at greater distances than Celtic armies. Strategic mobility was as important as tactical prowess. Roman military dominance was also supported by economic strength. The Roman state could afford to maintain standing armies year-round. Legionaries were paid professional soldiers who served for 20 to 25 years. This created a core of experienced veterans who formed the backbone of every legion. Celtic warriors were farmers and herders who fought seasonally. They could assemble for campaigns but had to return home for planting and harvest. Rome could wage war continuously. The tribes could not. The financial capacity to maintain professional armies came from Roman economic organization. Systematic taxation, monetary economy, long-distance trade, and specialized production created wealth that could be extracted and redirected toward military purposes. Celtic economies were largely subsistence-based with limited specialization. They could not generate the sustained surplus necessary to support permanent military establishments. This economic difference shaped military capabilities. Roman soldiers fought with standardized equipment mass-produced in specialized workshops. Armor, weapons, tools, and equipment were made to consistent specifications by craftsmen who did nothing else. A gladius made in one workshop was identical to one made in another. Parts were interchangeable. Quality was consistent. Celtic warriors equipped themselves individually. Each sword was unique, made by local smiths with varying skill levels. Quality varied enormously. There was no standardization, no interchangeability, no quality control. The Romans applied industrial logic to warfare before industrialization existed. Mass production of standardized equipment, systematic training of personnel, coordinated logistics, hierarchical command structures, division of labor and specialization. These organizational principles created military effectiveness that transcended the capabilities of any individual soldier. At Alesia, superior individual courage and skill meant nothing against this system. The Gallic warriors were not defeated because they lacked bravery. They were defeated because bravery without organization is insufficient against organized, disciplined, systematically supplied and trained forces. The Romans did not need to be braver. They needed to be more organized, and they were. The siege of Alesia lasted 42 days from the completion of fortifications to Vercingetorix's surrender. In that time, the Romans demonstrated every advantage their military system provided. Superior engineering that created fortifications the Gauls could not overcome, superior logistics that kept the army supplied while surrounded, superior discipline that maintained cohesion under extreme pressure, superior tactics that coordinated complex operations across miles of battlefield, superior equipment that protected soldiers and multiplied combat effectiveness, and superior organization that tied all these elements together into a system that functioned even when individual components failed. The Gauls brought courage, numbers, and home ground advantage. They brought warriors willing to die for freedom. They brought leaders who inspired through personal charisma. They brought everything that pre-state societies valued in warfare. None of it was enough. Discipline crushed tribal warfare at Alesia, and the pattern would repeat throughout history whenever organized states faced tribal opponents. The outcome was not determined by bravery or even by numbers. It was determined by systems, by organization, by the unglamorous work of logistics and engineering and training and discipline. Rome conquered because Rome had transformed warfare from a test of individual courage into an industrial process. And at Alesia, that process worked exactly as designed.